Well, students, today I have with me as my special guest Marcia Neave. As you know, Marcia Neave headed up the Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria. Marcia, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Rob.
Well, Marcia, you're an academic, a well-respected academic and lawyer, and you were the head of the reconstituted Victorian Law Reform Commission.
Yes.
What made you get into law in the first place?
It was sheer chance, really. I was going to do medicine, and then I didn't do as well as I hoped in physics and chemistry in year 11, and I thought I might be pushing it a bit. So then I thought I'd do an arts degree, and then my mother said, why don't you do law? And I did law, and I actually loved the course, really enjoyed it. At that stage I had no idea what I wanted to do.
Well, fantastic. The Law Reform Commission, there'll be some students watching this not sure which pathway their career should take. Some will want to work in a law firm, some will be considering law reform. The Law Reform Commission gig, tell us about that, how exciting it was, and should all lawyers be in the business of law reform?
Well, I think they should at least be interested in what the law does well and what it does badly. And I've actually got involved in law reform a long time before the Law Reform Commission. I'd done lots of law reform activities, and I just loved it because I loved the identification of the problem, working out what it was you could do to make the law better. Because it's a human system, it's always flawed, the law, and there are always ways you can do it better in the future. So that contributing to that was terrific, and it was a wonderful opportunity to go to the Law Reform Commission.
Well, let's cut to the chase. You were appointed by an enlightened Attorney General to the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, but you came from a background of academia, so you're really the first person from academia to be appointed to that position. Did you get much flack for not being part of the usual crowd, and indeed being a woman?
For some time I think I'd been arguing that there should be more women on the court, so it was great to be able to contribute in that capacity. As far as flack was concerned, I think my colleagues were generally very supportive, and the President of the Court of Appeal, Chris Maxwell, was enormously supportive. But there were some nasty things said in the legal profession. I got a few anonymous letters. There were a few letters to the newspapers about how could an academic possibly do something like this. But I think over time people got used to me and decided that I was doing all right. And I think academics can make a good contribution to a Court of Appeal. I think it might be a bit harder for an academic to be a trial judge, but there's certainly been very successful ones. I mean, Professor Paul Finn, who was a professor at ANU, ended up becoming a federal court judge and was very highly regarded, and he was a trial judge, and so he learned how to do it. It's not rocket science, you can do it.
What about the glass ceiling in the law? For years people have spoken about how hard it is for women to break through those barriers. Times have changed a bit, but from the time you started practising law to now, for instance, are things getting better for women in the law?
Slowly, and certainly there's lots more women law graduates than when I went to law school, when we were a minority of students. Now women, I think, are just the majority. And women do incredibly well in law school. So I don't think trickle up works. I think what you've got to do is make some positive decisions that you're going to appoint good women to jobs, and they will change things. You really need a critical mass, because if you just have, and this was the way it was for most of my career, if you just have a small number of women, it doesn't change the culture. Once you start getting up around 30-40%, then people start to think about doing things differently. And some years ago there was a project done interviewing magistrates, and they weren't asked any questions about how did women change things. They were asked a whole series of other questions, but ultimately they actually said that women had changed things, that the conversations were different, that women brought different perspectives. I don't think it makes a huge difference to the actual decision-making process, because the law is the law. It makes some, but it's those conversations you have, and when you're going into court or coming out of court, or how you look at people's experiences, and something that might seem entirely probable to a woman might to a man seem a little bit strange, because they wouldn't have had that experience.
So the Royal Commission into Family Violence, a huge gig really, and you completed it on time and indeed under budget. You would have heard some harrowing stories during that Royal Commission. Were there one or two things that came out of that that, despite all your experience, really rocked you?
I think the pervasiveness, I think one of the things that people said that struck me a lot of women said was, I wish I had been hit because then people might have understood it. So it was women who were subjected to psychological and financial abuse, often as well as physical abuse. They found that people just didn't understand it. I mean, women who were not allowed to have a mobile phone. One woman whose husband used to put her in the truck with the children and make her wait outside all night while he was doing night shift to control her behaviour. That was horrendous. And the other thing I think that shocked me was how slow we've been in understanding it, in getting the community to understand it and really doing something about it. This is a really major life-blighting event for many people in our community, and we've been slow really to recognise that. The law has been terribly slow, and also the law doesn't fit very well together with all the other systems. So what we need is systems that respond to all the needs of a person who's a victim of violence, and we also need to support people who use violence, because some of them want to change but haven't been able to.
Sure. A Royal Commission like this must have taken also a huge personal toll on you. How did you deal with a lot of the trauma that you were hearing about on a day-by-day basis? Did you have support around you in relation to the Commission?
Well, I had a wonderful staff who did a lot of the work and were very supportive. We were all supportive of each other. We had a regular opportunity for people to talk to a psychologist, which I used, I think, on 1 or 2 occasions. And we also provided psychological support to the people that gave evidence to us or participated in consultations. So if you came to a public consultation and you needed to, you could go immediately and talk to someone. And that made me feel confident that we weren't doing more harm to people by them participating in this process, and that's really important. I have to say, I had experience, of course, at the court dealing with horrible things. And one of the things that people often say is, well, judges aren't in touch with the real world. And I like to say to people who say that to me, who said that to me, well, how many incest cases have you encountered? How many cases of really, truly horrendous things have you had to deal with in your life? That's unfortunately part of the real world, and we had to deal with all of those issues. So I don't think it's true that as a judge I wasn't in touch with the real world. I was in touch with awful aspects of it in some cases. And of course with the Royal Commission, we're also in touch with something that is pervasive, horrible, that affects many people's lives, and yet many people don't understand, unfortunately, that that is part of the real world.
And the way the Royal Commission was set up, you had specific reporting timelines,
Yes.
You had a budget, and you're actually able to come in under budget.
Yes.
Do you think that model is a good model for other Royal Commissions, for instance, the one that's just been announced in the Northern Territory?
There are a couple of things I would say about that. My Royal Commission was a policy-based Royal Commission, so we didn't have to find facts in the way that if you're trying to work out what caused a bushfire or what happened in those terrible events in the Northern Territory. So it is a different process, but I think the notion that it's a sort of licence to spend as much money as you can is something that government should be very careful about, and government should think about how those budgets are done. Before they set up the Royal Commission, they should think very carefully about what really is needed. Unfortunately, we were able, I was very keen to come under budget, and in fact every law reform thing I've done, I think we've come under budget. So I was very keen to do that because it's public money, and if you're using it on a Royal Commission, you can't use it on other things. And we did make a suggestion to the government that the money that we saved could perhaps be used for some of the service provision, and that's really important.
So Marcia, you're delivering the Hickenbottom lecture at RMIT on the 25th of August. What can people expect when they turn up?
Well, I'm going to be talking about the Royal Commission and our recommendations, but one of the arguments in the lecture is we think about human rights in the context of family violence. People have a right to be free from being abused, obviously, but I would like to go a bit further than that and think about the fact that this is something that can happen to anyone, can happen to a child, can happen to an adult, and as a society we need to think about how we deal with people who have that particular vulnerability and how we help them recover. So that's going to be part of the lecture.
Fantastic. And last question, if you had one or two bits of advice for students watching this now, not sure where their career path might take them, a bit nervous about the upcoming course, what would those bits of advice be?
Well, I think have an open mind about where you want to go. Look at all the possibilities. Don't think you've got to go into a law firm and do mergers and acquisitions. There are lots of other things you can do. Enjoy it, have fun, but also keep your critical mind, keep questioning, keep asking questions, keep saying, why is it so? Is the law working well? How does it need to change?
Well, there you go, students, some great advice. The law is always evolving. Get into the business of law reform. That's the business we should all be in, and enjoy your course. Thanks for watching.